Hello everyone and welcome to our engineer interview today with Vincent. My name's Scott and I'm your host for today. Before we start, I just wanted to say thank you very much for signing up to this year's competition. For those of you who don't know, this is the Leaders Award competition, where we ask the question, if you were an engineer, what would you do? Pupils from the ages of 3 to 19 anywhere in the UK can join, and every person who takes part receives a named and graded certificate from a real-life engineer, just like the ones we interview. Now, we are very delighted to announce that we have some free posts available for schools who are looking to submit their entries. This has been provided by our national partner, Talus. So if you would like to check if your school is eligible, simply get in touch with your contact at Primary Engineer, and they'll let you know how to send your entries in. Now, these interviews, we are going to be speaking with engineers who work on loads of different projects, all of them showing the interesting, wonderful and exciting things that happen when you work in engineering. Our special guest today is going to start with a presentation all about being a brain engineer, and then we're going to go to the audience for some questions. But that's everything from me from now. I'm going to hand over to Vincent, who's going to start his presentation.
Hi everyone, good to see you. I can't see you, but you can see me. I hope you're all well. I came with a friend today before I do my presentation, and I'm really going to be talking about the brain because this is what I do. So I'll start my presentation and then I'll answer some of your questions. It's a plastic brain, by the way. Thank you very much, Scott, for inviting me to speak to you all today. So my name is Vincent. I'm a brain engineer, and I work at King's College London, which is one of the big universities in London. So I do research and I teach. So this is what we do when we work in university. So we teach students, medical students, psychology students, neuroscience students, and we do a lot of research. So we split our time between the two. And really what I try to do with my research, what me and my colleagues, we're trying to understand how the brain works, why does it go wrong sometimes, and what can we do about it afterwards to fix the problems. The engineering side, I initially trained as a biomedical engineering, so an engineer that specializes in medicine or in medical things, if you want. But now, me and my colleague, whatever we trained in, we all call ourselves neuroscientists. So we are scientists who work with the brain, so we're neuroscientists. We are really interested in mental health. So you know about your physical health, that you have to take care of your body. So what we are telling you is that you have to take good care of your brain as well, what's happening inside your head. And we study all these things you see on the screen here. But the brain is really interesting. There's loads of different ways you can study the brain. Some of my colleagues, they work in the lab. So they are scientists with white coats and they look inside microscopes and they see things like this. The little things you see moving on the screen, they're brain cells. So they're little cells inside your brain, they're called neurons. And you can see they're trying to connect to each other. And when they're connecting to each other, it can make, for example, some new memories, or it can make you learn something new, for example, or a new skill. So some of my colleagues are doing this, but I'm not looking at brain cells like this. Other colleagues are working with real brains. So I showed you a plastic brain earlier. Here you can see my colleague Claire, and she has a real brain in her hand. But I'm not doing this. I'm far too squeamish to be working with real brains. What I do is I use big machines like this one. It's called an MRI scanner. It's a big tube. You go in the tube. And once you are in the tube, me as a scientist, I take lots of photos of your brain when you're doing some experiments. So you go inside the tube, you do some experiments, you may be reading something on the screen or playing a game, and we just take lots of pictures of your brain whilst you're doing this experiment. These are some of the images we can get. Here we're looking at the size and the shape of the brain. So you can see the one on the top left that shows all the different parts of your brain. And I always like to show this one. I don't know how it looks like for you where you are, but you can see. So here we're looking at somebody's head from the top. Okay, we're looking at from the top, and you can see the eyes. You can see the nose, which is the cartilage inside your nose. And I don't know if you can see it on your screen, there's some little squidgy things here, squiggly things, which are inside your ears. It's your cochlea, it's a part of your ear. So this really looks like an alien brain. But then you can see all the different parts of the brain, and we are studying this, and the doctors are using these kind of images. The one on the right, this shows you all the blood inside the brain. If you want here, the brain, we're seeing a head rotating from the side, and we're seeing the blood. And the one at the bottom shows you all the different connections between the parts of the brain. So this is what we can do with this. When you go inside the tube, we can make these images. What I'm really more interested is what's going on in your brain when you're thinking. And so you'll be in the scanner, in this tube, doing an experiment, and then we can see which part of your brain is doing the experiment. Here we're looking at someone from the back, because you can see the ears there, and they're looking at different things on the screen. And depending on what you're looking at, different parts of your brain will be working harder. Our brain is really specialized for vision, because it's our biggest, it's our primary sense. So we have different parts of the brain that deal with looking at, for example, color versus black and white, or things moving versus things not moving, faces. We have a specific part in our brain, for example, that can detect faces. And this is why sometimes you see faces everywhere. You see faces in the clouds, you see faces in the bins outside, because there's a part of our brain which is always working really hard to look for faces everywhere. So what do we do? What do engineers do in neuroimaging? Neuroimaging, which is where I work, it's a big team effort. We work with doctors, with psychologists, with engineers, mathematicians. We all work together. But what about the engineers? What do we do? So of course, the engineers build the machines. Here we see a factory in India, and they are making these big tubes, these MRI scanners that we are using. Doctors are using in hospital to help people, but we're using them to do research. Our engineers are building the equipment, so some of my colleagues, because when you're going in a scanner to do some experiment, you need some devices, and you need some buttons to push, and these are different types of devices that we've been, including, I like this one at the bottom, where we use the recycling bin to make it into an experiment where you smell. So there's lots of different tubes in there, bottles with lots of different smells, some really disgusting smells, some really nice smells. And then you've got this really long tube, and you go inside the scanner, you lie down, and we just make you smell all these different things and see what's happening in your brain when you're smelling all these different substances. So engineers were not only building things, they are also writing all the computer code to do all the experiments and to produce this kind of images you see on the screen, which would be something you get at the end of the process, different parts of the brain doing different things. And our engineers, they write all the experiments as well. So you can see one at the top where you would be moving in a landscape, and you have to remember where you are in the landscape. And then like 10 minutes later, we put you back in this landscape somewhere else, and you have to move around until you remember, you go to your starting position. The one on the right is a different type of experiment where you just have to follow, you have some sort of joystick, like for playing a game, and you just have to follow the numbers in order or in reverse order, or depending on what the experiment is about. This may look really easy for you to do, but for some of our patients, it's really hard. So we're trying to see what's different in their brain when they're trying to do this. The one at the bottom, they go together. It's an experiment where we filmed in a supermarket, and then the cross you see in the middle, it's called eye tracking, and you can see the eyes moving at the top. So we can see where the person is looking. So we filmed the video, and it's all about understanding how people decide what to buy. And then we can see exactly where they're looking. And finally, just to show you another example, this is one of my studies where we used a proper video game in the scanner. We were, in this case, trying to evaluate a new treatment. So we were using this specific experiment there. So engineers are everywhere. They can do a lot of things in neuroimaging. And we do a lot of work with children, of course, as well. So that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to keep the rest of the time to answer your questions.
We're just now going to open up to questions from the
Yes,
audience.
yes.
If anybody does have any questions, please type them in the chat box. But I've got a question to start, Vincent. What do you love about your job?
That's a really good question to start. So it's really interesting as a job, and we play with a lot of big computers, big machines all the time, and we are doing something which is useful because we're trying to understand the brain, of course, but we're trying to help people as well. So a lot of the work we do is to understand disease and to try new treatments as well. So we're having a lot of fun, but we're doing something really useful at the same time for society, and it's always different.
Yeah, and you mentioned as well that there must be so many different amazing people you work with. Do you spend a lot of
Yes.
time working in teams, or is a lot of it you sitting down studying the brain?
No, I mean the work, because I'm an engineer in a university as well. So when you work in a university, it's big teams of people doing loads of different things. So both on the teaching side and on the research side, everybody has their own specialty. But because we all work together, we do much better job because we all understand a bit of what the others are doing, and together then we can do much better projects and bigger projects and better projects.
So we've got some questions coming in
Yeah.
now. Thank you very much for sending them in. We've got a few that have asked a similar question. I'm going to pick this one from New Mill
Okay.
Primary School.
So you deal with the questions. I'm not looking at them. Yeah.
Yes, don't worry, I'll pull them out, Vincent.
Okay.
But this question is, who or what inspired you to work with the brain?
That's a good question. I've always wanted to be a scientist since I was little, that's for sure. So I knew I wanted to be a scientist. I grew up in France, in the middle of nowhere, in a small village, before the internet. I don't know if you can believe this, children, but before the internet. So really, what brought me to science is science magazines, in a way that my parents subscribed me to a science magazine which I was getting every month, with all sorts of science. So I decided early on I want to be a scientist, and then I want to be an engineer, and then I wanted to be a medical engineer to do something useful for society, to help people. And then, of course, you have a choice about what to work with. You can choose to be specializing in the brain or in the leg or in whatever, the foot. But the brain is certainly the most interesting part of the body. So this is why I ended up doing this. So slowly moving to do brain research.
Well, I think it is a very interesting part of the body because we can tell from the questions, everyone has lots of questions they want to know more about the brain. So this
I'll try to be really quick in my answers so that we can answer as many as possible.
I like that. So this one comes from Mrs. Alanda, and Mrs. Alanda asks, what's the most interesting thing you've found out in your time as an engineer?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, to be fair, the most interesting thing I found out is that sometimes things don't work. A lot of the research we do, I've just finished a big 5-year project. It's what's called a clinical trial, where we're trying a new treatment and it just didn't work. So I think that's the most interesting things. Like, you think that scientists, they get everything right, they already get, but no, most of the time we get things completely wrong. And that's really interesting. That's the most interesting thing. What do you do after that? How do you bounce back from something which completely failed when you've spent potentially millions of pounds doing something that doesn't work? It's important for the knowledge of society that we know that this doesn't work, but what do we do about it? It's a bit like when Elon Musk rockets are exploding. We see them, they failed because the rockets have exploded, but they've got so much data before they exploded that they can make sure they don't explode next time. So that's, I think, the most interesting bit.
That is interesting, yeah. So we've got some more questions about the brain coming in now. This one comes from Mr. Aitken. What part of the brain recognizes faces?
Okay, so it's a special part of the brain at the back, which is called a fusiform face area, FFA. If you want to Google it, or whatever other search engine you use. So it's a small part of the brain that just is really specialized for faces. It's really interesting because vision, as I said, is the most important sense. So the brain is highly specialized for vision. We have like neurons. like if you go down to the brain cells, some neurons only activate, only fire up for like vertical lines. Others only respond to horizontal lines, for example. So it's really, really interesting.
Oh, wow. And more brain questions. This one comes from
Yeah,
Tom
of course.
Janet. How does the brain take care of automatic functions like breathing?
That's a good point. Well, I think as you said yourself, it's all automatic. So there's some of what we do is conscious, we decide on what we do, but so much of it is completely unconscious. We have no control of it. And it's interesting because it's one of these things, we have no control on breathing, for example. But if you really start to question yourself about your breathing, you may suddenly become much more aware of your breathing. It's like if you're like carrying a couple of glasses or something and you walking down the stairs, if you don't think about it, you'll be fine. If you start to be really thinking about it, how am I doing this at the same time? You would drop your glasses because suddenly your brain is not working automatically anymore. You're shining a light of your consciousness, if you want, towards this, and then
Oh, wow.
suddenly you may drop your glasses. So
Yeah.
the brain, because the brain is doing a lot of everything at the same time, we're using all our brain all the time, but there's only a few bits that we are conscious of at any time. All the rest is completely automatic.
Wow, that's yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I can just walk across the room without thinking about having to walk. It's just yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So we've got some more questions still. We'll stick with the questions about the brain just now. This one again comes from New Mill Primary. Are there any parts of the brain you can live without?
Yes,
Oh,
yes,
wow.
because for some time, some people they need to have brain surgery, for example, to remove parts of the brain. So yes, you can remove parts of the brain. There's a lot of what is called redundancy, which may not mean a lot to your children, but let's say that there's a lot of different parts of the brain that are doing the same thing. So you could afford to remove a better one and still be okay. But of course, it doesn't work for everything. We have some critical parts of the brain, for example, for language or for movement, and that if these parts get damaged or removed, then you wouldn't be able to speak anymore, or you wouldn't be able to move anymore. And it all depends on the age as well, because if you have any brain problems when you're a small child, your brain is really what we call plastic. The brain will reorganize itself. As an
Hmm.
adult, it's much harder for the brain to reorganize itself. So children are much more tolerant to having bits of their brain removed in a way that adults would be.
Well, that's interesting because there's a question as well that asks, how does your brain evolve? So does your brain change as you get older?
Oh yes, yes. The brain changes all your life because I mean, most people say it grows. I mean, when you are at your age on the coal, your brain is really like a sponge. It goes so fast. You have so many brain cells, so many connections between the brain cells that it's really easy for all of you on the call to learn new things at school. When I look at what my children are learning at school, I'm thinking, how can they remember all of that? There's so much. As an adult, I would struggle to remember all of this, but that's because your brains are different. Your brains are equipped to be learning all these things. And when you become older, all these different connections in the brain, they reduce. You have less and less connection. So you become more specialized in something as an adult. So it's harder for us to be learning new things. And the brain changes all the time. So you have an explosion of brain cells right now in your brains, millions and millions of new brain cells, every day. But I mean, it's hard to say exactly, about 20, 25 years old, this starts to slow down.
Ah,
So
so
brain, as we call it, brain maturation stops at about, in your 20s.
all right, interesting. So yeah, so it definitely is always evolving and changing. I like that. So we've got some more questions, and I like this question. This question is from Alaris. Why are people awake during brain surgery?
That's a good question. I mean, the first thing is the brain doesn't feel pain. There's no pain receptors in the brain, so
Oh,
you wouldn't feel it. Even if it just like I imagine it's really strange sensation, but it's not painful. And what they're doing is they're keeping the people awake to make sure that the surgeons do not cut through the important parts of the brain, like for speaking or for understanding or for moving. So they would just, if you want, poke your brain to see where these parts of the brain are for you, and then they will know they need to avoid this. So this is why they're keeping people awake, to make sure they don't damage some specific parts of the brain.
That's really interesting. So we've got more questions in, and we've got this question from Mr. Aitken. Where do you get the brains to work on?
So in my case, I work with real people, real brain, still inside people. But my colleagues, that's going to sound strange, but we have something called a brain bank, where people donate. When people die, they donate their brain for medical research. So we have healthy brains, and we have brains of people with all sorts of different diseases as well that we can use.
All right, so there's different sources, and as you say, you work with the brains that are still
Yes,
inside
I don't want
people's
to do.
heads.
I work only with real people and real brains. Yeah.
So we've got two questions that relate. So I'm going to ask them both at once. They come from Mrs. McQuarrie, who asks, "What part of your brain helps you memorize things?" And then this question from Darren, which is, "Why can't some people remember things as a baby?"
That's a good, interesting thing. So what part of the brain? So the memory, if you're on the center, there's loads of different parts, but the most important one is something we call the hippocampus.
Mhm.
It's in the center of your brain. And this is really the memory center of your brain, because if this part of the brain gets damaged, for example, people have lots of memory problems. So it's really at the center of memory. And why do some people remember things as baby? I think there's been some studies of this, and I'm not sure it's true. I think it's one of these things where people think they remember. It's mostly false memories, where people think they may remember what happened to them when they were 2 years old, but babies probably not. And one of the reasons is your memory is really linked to language.
Okay.
So it's like if before you can speak, you can't store memories in the same way. I mean, it's an interesting question because there's a lot of disagreement about this and a lot of research on this. I think you only start remembering things when you start acquiring language.
All right, I like that. We've got another question here. This one comes from Cardonald Primary. What part of the brain makes you feel emotions?
Oh, that's interesting. So there's different parts of the brain for different emotions. So there's a lot of overlap between them, but it's different parts of the brain. There's one that comes up in a lot of different emotions is something called the amygdala, which is a tiny, tiny round structure. There's two of them. There's one on each side, again, in the middle, deep inside your brain. And these are the ones dealing with fear, sadness, anxiety, all of this. This region is key for that, for example. But yeah, different emotions have got different networks in the brain.
Wow. So so much of it sounds like it overlaps. There's not this bit of the brain does this, that bit does that. It all seems
No,
to
because
spread out.
apart from things like language or motion, which are clearly dedicated to one function, one really, really important function, most brain regions are doing different things.
So we've got a few questions coming in that's about what it takes to become a brain engineer. And one of the questions that was asked from New Mill Primary is, how many years of training did you go through to become a brain engineer?
Well, yes, that's a good question. So I mean, I did the usual. Well, I studied in France, but the equivalent here would be, I went to university. I would have done my 3 years undergraduate, and then another year equivalent to a master's. So be 4 years, and then I did a PhD to get a doctor, which is a doctorate. So I'm a doctor, not a medical doctor, but a doctor in imaging. But that was another, because I was working at the same time. For me, it was 6 years. So it was probably, for me, it was a good 10 years after university. No, 10 years from entering university. But because I was doing this whilst working,
Yeah,
I studied. Yeah.
And I suppose it sounds like you're still in training because you're learning new things about the brain every day.
That's a perfect question, perfect point. Yes, the more we learn, the less we learn, the less we understand. Basically, the more we learn about the brain, the less we understand. So we'll never be out of work.
Yeah. And also, because it sounds like a really, really interesting job, but this question from Miss McQuarrie is, what's your least favorite part of the job?
Oh, I'm sure the teachers will agree with me there. It's actually marking. When students do their examinations and we have to mark all these copies, that's the least favorite part of the job. That's the part which I would like AI, ChatGPT and its friends to do for me, marking.
Yes, that sounds like something that your brain doesn't enjoy doing. I like that.
Yeah.
So we've got this question in from Caitlin, and Caitlin asks, is there anything we can do to keep our brains healthy?
That's a great question. Sleep. Make sure you have a proper night's sleep, because when you sleep, your brain is cleaning itself. So basically, your brain is flushed out with lots of liquids and chemicals which are just cleaning the brain when you sleep. And when you sleep as well, your memories, so the things you've learned in school, they get really solidified, if you want, in your memory when you sleep. So really sleeping is important, and eating well and exercising. I mean, there's nothing surprising there. It's the same as for the rest of your body, really.
I like that. So looking at the time, we've got time for a few more questions. So if anybody
Yes.
out there has got some, please send them in. One question we've got here, Vincent, is what excites you about the future of study into the brain? What do you think's
Mm.
coming in the next 10 years?
Yes, what's really exciting is we have a lot of new equipment coming, lots of new machines, so we can go, we can take these pictures of the brain faster and faster with more and more details. So we can see more and more, try to understand more and more what's going on in the brain. And like in a lot of professions these days, AI, the fact that we now have artificial intelligence to help us, again, to help us to be faster, to analyze the data in different ways, to find patterns between different experiments, which we may not even realize ourselves, but actually there's a lot in common between different experiments, but the AI systems could do this for us.
Oh, wow, and that must free up your time to be able to look at a lot more, and then more can get done as well.
I think exactly that's fine. It's AI is not going to replace us, but it's going to make us a lot more efficient.
I like that. So we've got some more questions in. This one
Yeah.
comes from Isla at Sycamores. Why do we get headaches?
Well, that's a good point, because I was saying earlier that the brain doesn't feel pain. So headaches is actually not really the brain. The headaches is more about the blood, the blood, the blood supply to your head. So even if it feels like it's coming from inside your head, it's not. It's something to do with the blood supply, which is all around your head. And this is where the headaches are coming from. Of course, you can have some diseases as well, where there's some specific brain-related disease, but most of the headaches you can think about, they're actually not brain-related. They're more, scalp and skeletal related, because you've been on your screen for a long time, on your phone for a long time. It's not really the brain which aches, it's the bones and the blood around. But we do study migraines, and we do study big headaches as well.
I wonder if it's the same. Mr. Aitken asks, why do you feel dizzy when you turn yourself upside down? Is that blood as well?
Well, that's not the brain, that's really your inner ear. Do you remember in the images
Ah,
earlier, I was showing you these squiggles? So there's some liquid inside your ear that explains to your brain what the level is, that you are level, where you are. And if you start moving around, like the liquid is sloshing around, and then the information you get from both sides is not the same anymore, and it keeps changing, and this is why you get dizzy, or this is why you get dizzy on a boat as well, because the liquid, instead of standing still, is always moving around.
all right, that makes sense
So,
actually.
so if you want, it's the bit that tells your brain which way is up and which way is down.
So yeah, I'd never thought about that, but yeah, you're right. On a boat, you're doing this, so all
Yeah.
of it's moving. So we've got time for a couple more questions. I like this one. This one comes from Yasmin's class. Can we understand animals and what they feel by looking at their brain?
Yes, so we do done some research on animals. I've got some colleagues who are specialized in dogs, for example. So they're doing the same thing. They put the dogs in the machine and like would show them different pictures of their owners or somebody else, or different voices. So yes, we can do exactly the same thing we do with you. We can do it with animals as well. Of course, some animals are really hard. You couldn't put a bird in a scanner or something like this. But there's a lot of work in animal consciousness, trying to understand what animals feel, how they feel, and how different they are from us. It's interesting because when I was your age, we knew that, like, elephants were intelligent and dolphins were intelligent, but that's it really. But now we know that most animals are, birds, especially crows, are like really, really intelligent. They use tools and everything. So it's just because our definition of intelligence changes as well. But we do experiment it and realize, yeah, no, we're not just a few intelligent creatures on the planet. There's a lot of animal intelligence, and potentially plant as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Okay, I think we get time for one more question. I like this
Yeah.
one. What advice do you have for anyone out there who wants to learn more about the brain and becoming an engineer?
That's a really good question. I mean, stay curious about everything. I think that's a good advice. Just be open, stay curious, and send me a message and come and talk to me. I think that's and I can tell you what to do. I mean, there's so many different paths, as I was saying. There's so many of us working. We all say we are these neuroscientists, but you can study psychology, you can study mathematics or engineering, or you can study languages or whatever, and you still do brain imaging at the end.
Brilliant. So that's some good advice. Stay curious and ask Vincent. I like that.
Yeah, and please, for the schools, I know there was a lot of questions there on the
Yeah,
list which I could not answer. I'll be more than happy to answer them by emails if you send them to me afterwards.
brilliant. Anybody who does, we can send the details out as well so we can make sure you can ask. But looking at the time now, I would just like to bring the interview to a close
Yeah.
by saying thank you to everyone for joining us, but a massive thank you to Vincent for helping inspire all the
Thank you,
engineers in the
everyone.
making out there. Now it's your turn, everyone, to come up with your own engineering ideas. Remember and send them to us once you've finished so we can get our certificates sent out, and we will hopefully see you at our in-person exhibitions at the end of the school year. And remember, we have free post available, thanks to the support from Talus. So if you would like to get your entries in sent for free, please get in touch with us at Primary Engineer. But a massive thank you again to everyone out there, and thank you, Vincent. And remember, if you were an engineer, what would you do?